It was just another sunny afternoon in Los Angeles, the kind where the warmth settled gently on the streets, and people went about their daily routines without much thought. The grocery store bustled with life, carts rolling smoothly over the tiled floors, the quiet murmur of shoppers exchanging polite greetings, and the rhythmic beeps of checkout registers filling the air. It was an ordinary day, or at least it seemed that way, until a single voice broke through the hum of normalcy and turned a simple shopping trip into something unforgettable. Snoop Dogg, a man recognized by millions yet at home in his own neighborhood, moved through the produce aisle with an easy, unbothered air. Dressed in a comfortable hoodie and jeans, he blended effortlessly with the other shoppers, scanning the rows of fresh fruit as he filled his basket. There was no entourage, no flashing cameras, just a man picking up his groceries, as unassuming as anyone else. But not everyone saw him that way. Near the apples, an elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson stood, adjusting her glasses with slow precision. She must have been in her late 70s, her silver hair pinned neatly in place, her cardigan fastened tightly, as if she had stepped out of another time. She exuded the kind of careful order that suggested she liked things a certain way. And in that moment, something about the presence of Snoop Dogg disrupted that order. She turned sharply, her gaze locking onto him, her lips pressing into a thin, disapproving line. And then she spoke, her words crisp, deliberate, and loud enough for those nearby to hear. "You people don't belong here." The air in the store seemed to shift, as if sucked out by the force of her words. Shoppers hesitated in their movements, their conversations faltering mid-sentence. Some pretended not to hear, turning their eyes back to their lists or their carts, while others looked on, their expressions flickering between discomfort and disbelief. But Mrs. Thompson wasn't done. "Why don't you go back to Africa?" The words settled over the space like a heavy fog, thick and suffocating. They carried the weight of something far older than the moment, something rooted in history and pain. Snoop stood still, his fingers pausing over his phone. There were many ways he could respond. He could meet her sharpness with his own, unleash the kind of verbal retort that would leave no doubt as to where he stood. He could turn away, ignore it, refuse to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Or he could do something entirely unexpected. For a moment, he simply breathed. The pause stretched, filling the space between them. And then, slowly, he straightened his shoulders, set his basket down beside him, and turned to face her fully. He was about to speak. "But before we continue, how would you react in a moment like this? Would you meet fire with fire? Would you walk away? Or would you take a different path? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because moments like these, they define who we truly are." The air in the grocery store felt heavier, as if everyone inside had taken a collective breath and was now holding it. The once ordinary afternoon had transformed into something else entirely, a moment charged with tension, uncertainty, and an unspoken question lingering in the minds of those who had witnessed what had just happened. Mrs. Thompson stood with her back straight, her hands gripping the edge of her cart as though it anchored her. Her words had been sharp, unfiltered, filled with a conviction that seemed unshakable. Around her, a few shoppers shifted uncomfortably, their faces betraying the unease they felt but dared not voice. A mother pulled her child a little closer, instinctively protective. A young grocery clerk, mid-task, hesitated, eyes flickering toward Snoop, uncertain whether to intervene or stay silent. Snoop Dogg, however, didn't react immediately. He stood there, his grocery basket resting at his side, his expression unreadable. His usual relaxed demeanor hadn't changed, but there was something different in the way he carried himself now. A quiet gravity, a consideration for what came next. He let the moment breathe, let the weight of her words hang between them before he spoke. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but steady. "Do you realize what you just said?" Mrs. Thompson's lips pressed into a thin line. There was no hesitation in her response, no regret. "I said what I said. This is my country. People like you don't belong here." The words cut through the air, sharper this time, more deliberate. A gasp came from the bread aisle, where a young woman stopped mid-reach for a loaf of rye. Near the dairy section, a man lowered his phone, his expression unreadable. The store, once buzzing with mundane activity, had turned into something else entirely, a stage for an unexpected confrontation. Snoop nodded slowly, as if absorbing the full weight of her statement. He could have chosen anger. He could have lashed out, turned his back, or dismissed her entirely. But instead, he chose something else. "Let's talk about that," he said, his voice even, his tone measured. "Since you brought it up." There was no sarcasm, no defensiveness, only a quiet strength, a willingness to stand his ground with dignity. He wasn't looking to argue. He wasn't looking to win. He was looking for something deeper, a lesson, an understanding, a shift in perspective that maybe, just maybe, could be planted in this very moment. The tension remained, thick and unrelenting, but something had changed. The conversation had just begun. Snoop held Mrs. Thompson's gaze, his expression unwavering yet calm. He didn't raise his voice, didn't let frustration seep into his words. Instead, he spoke with a quiet strength, of a voice that carried not just his own story, but the stories of generations before him. "You say I don't belong here," he repeated, his tone measured. "But let me tell you about where I come from." The store was silent, the murmurs of onlookers now completely stilled. Even those who had tried to mind their own business couldn't help but listen. "My great-great-grandfather was born in California," Snoop continued. "But before that, my ancestors didn't come here by choice. They were forced, brought in chains, made to work under the cruelest conditions. They built this country, its roads, its buildings, its wealth. The very foundations of the America you stand in today were laid by people like my ancestors." Mrs. Thompson's grip on her apples tightened. She wasn't looking away, but the certainty in her face had started to waver. Around them, the audience grew, subtle movements of people edging closer, wanting to hear more, drawn in by the weight of his words. Snoop didn't break his gaze. "My grandfather," he went on, "fought in the Korean War. He put on the uniform of this country, risked his life for it. But when he came home, he couldn't even sit at the same lunch counters as the men he had fought beside, couldn't drink from the same water fountains, couldn't buy a home in the same neighborhoods. And still he stayed. Still, he believed in the promise of this country, even when it didn't believe in him." A few people in the crowd exhaled slowly, some shifting their weight, absorbing the story in a way they hadn't expected when they walked in that afternoon. "And my parents," Snoop continued, his voice softer now, but no less powerful, "they fought too. Not with fists or weapons, but with education, with dignity, with perseverance. My mother's a teacher. She spent her life making sure children knew they were worth something, no matter where they came from. My father, a community leader, the kind of man who would stop on the side of the road to help someone like you, ma'am, if your car had broken down." The crowd had stopped pretending to shop. A cashier leaned in slightly from her register, captivated. A man near the deli counter folded his arms, nodding, as if he understood something he hadn't before. "So when you say I don't belong here," Snoop said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his message, "I have to tell you, you're wrong. I am as much a part of this country as you are. Maybe even more, because my family paid for it in blood, in sweat, in years of fighting to be seen as equal. And despite everything, we're still here." The hum of the refrigerators, the occasional beep of a register, it all seemed to fade into the background. Mrs. Thompson's lips pressed tightly together, but the fire behind her eyes had dimmed. She looked around, as if searching for someone who might validate what she had said earlier. But no one spoke. No one defended her words. For the first time, she seemed to consider what she had said, not just as something she had thrown into the air, but as something real, something that had weight, and maybe, just maybe, something she wished she could take back. A heavy silence filled the store, thick with the weight of words spoken and the emotions they carried. The air, once buzzing with the mundane sounds of everyday shopping, now held a different energy, one that pressed upon everyone standing in that aisle. The moment lingered, stretching longer than anyone had anticipated. Then, from the edge of the crowd, a voice broke through. It was quiet but firm. "He's right." The words came from a man wearing a faded baseball cap, his stance hesitant but his conviction clear. Derek, as his name tag read, took a step forward, glancing at those around him before repeating, "We've got to be better than this." The ice cracked. Another voice followed, this time from a woman near the frozen foods. Her hair was pinned back, her eyes filled with something between pride and nostalgia. "My dad fought in that same war," she said. "He always told me the only color that mattered was the red on the flag." The murmurs swelled, low at first, then growing as people found the courage to say what they had been thinking. A cashier, no older than 20, called out from behind her register, "I've never seen anyone handle something like that with so much grace." "Thank you." Mrs. Thompson's hands trembled slightly, still clutching the apples as if they were the only thing grounding her. She looked around, searching the faces of those nearby for an ally, someone who would nod in agreement, someone who would validate what she had said. But there was no one. The realization settled in, her shoulders sinking slightly under its weight. Snoop took a small step closer, not in challenge but in understanding. His voice, now softer, carried a warmth that hadn't been there before. "It's not about what you meant," he said. "It's about how it came across. Words matter. Actions matter even more." For a moment, Mrs. Thompson's lips parted as if she were about to respond. A defense, an explanation, something. But she stopped herself. Instead, she exhaled sharply, her gaze dropping for the first time. Then, a single clap echoed through the store. It came from the deli counter, hesitant but firm. A second followed, then a third. The sound grew, rolling through the store in a wave of acknowledgement, not just for Snoop's words, but for the weight of the moment itself. Mrs. Thompson swallowed hard. "I didn't mean." She hesitated, the words drying up before they could fully form. She shook her head slightly, as if realizing that whatever excuse she had was no longer relevant. Snoop nodded once, a quiet but deliberate gesture. It wasn't a nod of victory, nor of triumph. It was one of understanding, of knowing that in that small moment, something had shifted. He had done what he came to do. The events of that afternoon did not stay confined to the aisles of the grocery store. Long after Mrs. Thompson had wheeled her cart away, and the last of the onlookers had resumed their shopping, the weight of what had transpired lingered. Word spread quickly, not just among those who had witnessed it firsthand, but through hushed conversations at coffee shops, phone calls between friends, and eventually, social media posts recounting the moment in detail. By the evening, the story had taken on a life of its own. People who hadn't been there felt as though they had, their minds painting vivid images of the confrontation and its resolution. The words exchanged between Snoop and Mrs. Thompson became more than just dialogue. They became symbols of something deeper, of history, of change, of the power in choosing to educate rather than retaliate. At her small dining table, Mrs. Thompson sat alone, her cup of tea growing cold as she replayed the encounter over and over again in her mind. For years, she had lived with certain beliefs, ones passed down through generations, reinforced by the circles she had surrounded herself with. But now, doubt crept in. Could she have been wrong? Could she have been holding on to something that no longer had a place in the world she lived in? She recalled the faces around her in that store, the silent disapproval, the hesitant nods toward Snoop, the young cashier who had spoken up with admiration rather than condemnation. It was a realization that hit her harder than she expected. She had been alone in her thinking that day, completely and utterly alone. Meanwhile, Snoop moved through his evening as he always did, but something about the day's events settled differently within him. He wasn't a stranger to prejudice, nor to moments where his very existence seemed to challenge another's worldview. But this time felt different. This time, it wasn't just about him. It was about the people who had watched, who had absorbed, who had carried the conversation beyond that store's doors. Strangers approached him, not with pity or anger, but with gratitude. A woman in a diner, likely in her 60s, rested a hand on his arm as she passed by his table. "I heard what you said today," she murmured, "and I just want to say thank you." A young father, holding his toddler's hand, stopped him outside a gas station later that evening. "I told my son about you tonight," he admitted, his voice full of quiet emotion. "Told him what you said back there. That's the kind of man I want him to grow up to be." Snoop nodded, absorbing their words but saying little in response. He had never set out to teach a lesson, nor had he expected to become part of a wider conversation. He had only done what he felt was right in the moment. But it was clear now. His words had resonated far beyond those aisles. Days passed, but the ripples continued. Talk shows debated the moment. Radio hosts dissected it. Community groups gathered to discuss what it meant in the broader scope of history. It wasn't just about an old woman in a grocery store. It was about the weight of words, the power of patience, the courage it took to stand firm without standing in anger. And somewhere in the quiet of her home, Mrs. Thompson found herself listening. Not arguing, not defending, but simply listening. Perhaps for the first time in her life. The encounter in the grocery store was more than a clash of words. It was a moment of reckoning. It was a stark reminder that even in the most ordinary places, the battle for understanding, respect, and dignity is ongoing. Snoop had not just responded to a remark. He had planted a seed, one that had begun to take root in the minds of those who had witnessed it, and perhaps even in Mrs. Thompson herself. In the days that followed, people continued to talk about what had happened. Some debated whether change was truly possible, while others reflected on the power of patience and restraint. Conversations that might never have taken place before were now unfolding across dinner tables, workplace break rooms, and community centers. This was the true power of the moment, not in the confrontation itself, but in the impact it left behind. Mrs. Thompson, too, found herself thinking. She had spent much of her life believing certain things to be true, never questioning the ideas passed down to her. But something about that day had unsettled her. The way people had looked at her. Not with agreement, not with validation, but with something else. Disappointment, perhaps. Or maybe, just maybe, hope that she would reconsider. Late one evening, she sat by her window, staring at the fading light outside. The world had changed around her in ways she had never fully acknowledged. And now, she was faced with a choice. To remain steadfast in beliefs that isolated her, or to listen, to learn, and to grow. She didn't know if she could change overnight, but for the first time, she considered trying. For Snoop, life continued as it always had, but he carried the moment with him. He knew that standing up wasn't always about speaking the loudest or winning an argument. Sometimes, it was about holding your ground with dignity, about choosing wisdom over anger, about offering a lesson instead of a fight. And more often than not, those choices had the greatest impact. To everyone watching, reading, or hearing this story, remember this. Your words matter. Your actions shape the world in ways you may never fully see. Every moment is a chance to choose between division and unity, between ignorance and understanding, between resentment and compassion. What will you choose? If this story moved you, share it. Talk about it. Let's make these conversations happen in every home, in every community, in every heart. The world changes when people listen, when they care, and when they stand for something greater than themselves. Like, comment, and subscribe to keep spreading the message of respect, resilience, and hope.